For the third reading, I've chosen Luke's account of resurrection, and it begins actually on the Good Friday and spills over. It was preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes. But they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee? The Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." Then they remembered his words. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves. And he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. These are words inspired by God. Easily the most memorable Easter Sunday of my life was 1975. I was living at the time in a mission in Kenya called Kipchimchim, literally the place of the springs. And I'd been there from 1973 until 1979. But this was Easter Sunday, 1975. And Kipchimchim was a big compound. We had, as well as the mission, we had a convent of African sisters called the Asumbi Sisters, who ran a little maternity hospital on the compound. We had a primary school, we had a secondary school, and we had a hostel for physically disabled children, mainly polio victims, who lived on the compound during the school year and then went home during the holiday time. And so we had a full-time carpenter employed. Appropriately enough, his name was Joseph. But I always remember Easter Sunday, 1975. So very typically what would happen on a typical Sunday, I'd say Mass in the Central Mission in the morning, early in the morning, and then a whole group of us would go off. I had a Datsun pickup, and it'd be crowded in the back with 25, 30 people in the back. And we'd head off to an outstation and then say Mass in the outstation, and then go on to a second outstation and say Mass there, and then come back home in the evening about 6 p.m. And so it's Easter Sunday morning in the Central Mission, and they've put on a passion play. You know, it was an extraordinary play. And so we had the entire works. We had Pilate and Herod and the high priests and Jesus and the disciples and Mary, everybody involved. And the guy who was playing the part of Jesus was a guy called Stephen Langat. And Stephen was a character. And so there was lots of ketchup being employed. And there was the whole trial before Pilate and before the high priest and in front of Herod. And the crowd get into this in a big, big way. But finally, Jesus is put on the cross and he's speared to death, Stephen Langat. And so they take him down. And in the meantime, our carpenter Joseph had prepared a big coffin. And they put Stephen into the coffin. And they covered it over. And all of a sudden, the coffin starts moving, and there's this kelele, all this noise inside in the coffin, and the top of it flies off, and Stephen stands up wearing one of my white albs, and he's looking around him as if to say, "Who are the schmucks that crucified me? Where? Point them out to me." Really angry face, and the crowd are cheering like crazy. And suddenly, Herod collapses with a heart attack, and Pilate collapses with a heart attack, and everybody starts cheering like hell. So we continue with the Mass. And then we go off on the Mass safari, and we pile into my orange Datsun pickup, and I've got 2 nuns in the front with me, and about 25 people in the back, you know, and 3 big crosses, because we're going to repeat this in one of the outstations. And we drive into the nearest town, which is called Kericho, which is the center of the tea growing district of Kenya. And then we're going off on a whole bunch of side roads. And we run into this huge, huge crowd of people. And I suddenly realize the East African Safari is coming through that area. Now, the East African Safari was an annual road race that went on for about 10 days. Started in Uganda, then went into Tanzania and finished up in Kenya around Easter time. And you'd have like 40 or 50 of these cars just whining through at extraordinary speeds on all these dirt roads. And so there's a huge crowd lining the roads. And there's this apoplectic superintendent of police. He stops me, he says, pull over. So we pull over to the side of the road and I keep going until I'm at the edge of the crowd. And then I floor the accelerator and keep going. And about 2 miles later, this cop car comes flying after us and nudges into the ditch. And 3 cops get out with rifles and the superintendent and line us all up against the side of the road. We got the 2 nuns, about 25 people, and 3 crosses and myself. And we thought for a moment they're going to shoot us. And then in the back, we hear this whining of the cars. The East African Safari is about maybe 10 miles away. We hear this really loud whine of a rally car. And the policeman is going apoplectic. He says, get back to town and report to the police station. And I said to him, which do you think is more important, the resurrection of Jesus or watching mud-colored cars switch by? So at this stage, he's freaking out. He jumps back into his car. The Askaris with the rifles jump back in and they take off on a side road. And I go off on a second side road down to the outstation. And about maybe 2 minutes later, the first car comes whining through with this big cloud of dust. And so we have Mass that day. And it was the only day in my life that I actually, as a priest, celebrated 6 sacraments in one day. So we start off typically with confession, and people line up. There's no confessional box. I'm sitting on a stool, and people are putting their elbows on my knees, and they're talking. So we have confession for everybody. And then we have the Mass. And then there's a whole bunch of people who are going to receive their first Holy Communion. They've been training for a year in the catechumenate. And on special occasions, the bishop, who couldn't get around to all of the outstations or all of the parishes even, we had permission as the father in charge, or what you'd call here, the pastor, to do confirmations occasionally. So I confirm a whole bunch of these people. And then there are 3 couples who are going to get married in the same day. So we do 3 marriages. And when the Mass finished, they tell me there's an old lady outside the village who's dying, and would I come and anoint her? And I go and anoint her. So 6 sacraments in one day. So very, very easily, it was the most memorable Easter Sunday of my life. So with that as a background, I want to kind of dip into what for me is the extraordinary mystery, the mysticism of the notion of resurrection. And the first thing to examine is to look at this notion of what do we mean when we say body. So when we talk about the resurrection of Christ from the dead, what exactly are we talking about? Now, part of the problem is the word that we use in English, the word body, is really, it is totally inadequate for conveying what's involved here. When we think of the body in the West, we think of, an organism with about 100 trillion cells with different subsystems, different organs, endocrine system, immune system, etc. We think that's what the body is. The Egyptians had a different notion. They talked about 2 kinds of body. They called it about Ka and Ba. One is the physicality, and the other is kind of the etheric blueprint of which the physical body is simply a printout. But the Greeks had 3 words for body. The word sarx, the word soma, and the word pneuma. And sarx had to do with this flesh and blood stuff, whereas soma had to do with the kind of the more etheric body, and pneuma, from which we get the word spirit, had to do obviously with the spiritual body. And so in order to understand resurrection, and even to understand Eucharist, you have to understand the usage. The New Testament is written in Greek. So particularly when you read Paul's first letter to Corinthians in chapters 11 and chapter 15, where he's talking about Eucharist and he's talking about resurrection, he says, sarx cannot inhabit the kingdom of God. This kind of stuff, flesh and blood. So Paul is not talking about sarx, about flesh and blood, when he's talking either about Eucharist or about resurrection. And so you have to go to a different level of what body means for the Greeks in order to understand what the Gospels are trying to portray. Hinduism, however, does it much better, in my opinion, because in Hinduism, you've got 7 different levels of body, vibrating at much, much higher levels than the previous ones. So you have the physical body, which is vibrating between infrared and ultraviolet. between 400 and 700 nanometers. And then you get the etheric body, of which the physical body is simply a hard copy. And then you've got the astral body, the place of our emotions, the body we inhabit when we're dreaming at night. And according to Hinduism, the place where we archive all of the experiences of the incarnation just ending when we're dying. And then you have the mental body, which is more like Plato's ideal realm, the place of ratiocination, the place from which we download all great insights and ideas. And then you have the psychic body, where we're in touch with our abilities, clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, telepathy, precognition, psychokinesis, these kinds of things. And then you have the soul body, and then ultimately you have source itself. And so when you're dealing with Hinduism, then the notion of resurrection is much more complex and much more satisfying. So I'm going to just play around with a few metaphors for a few minutes. There was this great book written sometime in the late 1850s by a guy called Abbott. It's called Flatland. And he's talking about a three-dimensional sphere that encounters a two-dimensional plane surface. And the beings who reside on flatland, the two-dimensional surface, so they're either straight lines or squares or circles or, two-dimensional figures, they can't grok any kind of three-dimensional reality. So this sphere is trying to interact with it, and of course they can't detect it. But he manages to make a disciple of one flatland being. And finally he says, if I were to pass through the plane on which you live, initially all you'd see would be a dot. And then the dot would widen out into a circle, and the circle would get bigger and bigger and bigger until I'm halfway through, and then it would get smaller and smaller and smaller, and then it would disappear as I'm moving through a two-dimensional reality. So finally, this two-dimensional being is able to grok it. And the three-dimensional sphere takes him into 3D land and shows him the wonders of 3D land. And the creature from Flatland says, well, if there's a third dimension, maybe there's a fourth and a fifth and a sixth dimension. And the third dimensional sphere says, don't be ridiculous, it's impossible, there's only 3 dimensions. So in some senses, depending on our worldview and our sense of dimensionality, either we're able to experience or not experience, the notion of resurrection. But if you dig deep into even quantum mechanics, there's a notion in quantum mechanics called quantum tunneling. And that's where when particles meet an obstacle, a solid obstacle, depending on the density of the obstacle and depending on the kinetic energy of the particle, it can pass right through it, through solid objects. And so this, I like to play around with these kinds of images, these scientific images, and think about what were the writers of scripture trying to portray when they had these very, very real experiences of a resurrected Christ. Even the very verb that's used in Greek that we translate into English as appear, he appeared to his disciples. The word appear in Greek doesn't mean that if Jesus comes into the room, then everybody who's in the room, if they look in a specific way, they're going to see Jesus. The verb appear means to choose to make himself visible to. So in some senses, it's there are 2 parts to it. There's the Jesus figure choosing to make himself visible, and there are other people in the audience who have the ability to make the kind of dimensional shift in order to encounter Jesus at that level. And so it's not where we look, but it is how we look. I'm convinced that if I don't know how to look, I can look everywhere and find nothing. If I do know how to look, it doesn't matter where I look, I'll find everything. So it's the how of the look that determines the appearance. So in some senses then, the disciples also need to shift their focus in order to be able to make a connection to this resurrected body of Jesus. And it reminds me of an incident when I came to the States in 1987, and I was going to school, and I needed to buy a binder for notes. And I'm walking down University Avenue, and there was a Woolworth shop in University Avenue at that stage. And I'm looking in through the front glass window of Woolworths to see if there's a kind of a binder in there and how much it would cost. The problem is the sun is shining on the glass, and so all I can see is my own reflection. So as I'm looking in the window, I can't see the contents until I manage somehow to shift the focus of my eyes, and now I can see through the window rather than at the window. So that's the sense of appearance that we get in the New Testament, that it's the ability to shift the focus and to look kind of differently. And so I'm going to just play around with a bunch of metaphors for a few minutes. Suppose I have a friend who's visiting, I'm going to say from Alabama, and he's staying in Palo Alto in a hotel, and he's on the 5th floor. And he wonders if I might drive down to Palo Alto so we could have lunch together in the dining room. So I drive down there. He's on the 5th floor. The restaurant is in the lobby, but the parking is underground. So I have to go down 3 or 4 levels to get a parking spot. And then I got to go up 3 or 4 levels to get to the lobby. And he's on the 5th floor. He's going to have to come down 4 or 5 levels to get to the lobby as well. So he's got to come down and I got to go up. So in some senses, that's what any kind of mystical experience is like. Is that the object of my veneration or the object of my mystical kind of experience somehow has to lessen the density and come down several floors. And I got to change the density and go up several kinds of floors. And then we can encounter each other. So it involves dimensional shifts on both parties. And that's exactly, for instance, what happens at night when we're dreaming. That, for instance, when we have experiences, mystical experiences when we're dreaming, it's like we've shifted our density from the physical body to the astral body, and the denizens at the other side are coming down a few levels, and we're meeting in the lobby somehow. Without the knowledge of flora, you could never infer the possibility of a golden daffodil from an ugly bulb, or the possibility of an elegant oak tree from the presence of a tiny acorn. You couldn't do it. And the same way, I believe, without a mystical sense, you could never infer the reality of spirit from the presence of mere matter, nor the existence of soul from the experience of the ego. And so in some senses, trying to measure the reality of resurrection by using the senses is the same thing as trying to measure somebody's IQ with a weighing scale. It is totally inadequate to it. So just a few images to play around with. And then I'm always fascinated by what I call the 2 crosses that appear in the kind of the last few chapters of the Gospels. One of them I call the cross of crucifixion, and the other I call the cross of resurrection. So when I think of the cross of crucifixion, this figure, I'm not focused on it as a kind of an instrument of torture on which Jesus was killed. Rather, for me, the vertical arm of the cross represents the connection between God's transcendence and God's immanence, the total, ineffable, inarticulatable reality that is God, and the immanence of God as how she manifests herself through nature, for instance. So for me, the vertical arm of the cross represents that connection between transcendence and immanence. And the horizontal arm of the cross, for me, represents the connection between all forms of immanence, what Native American Indians will call all my relations, that literally all sentient beings, not just on planet Earth, but in the entire cosmos itself, that it's represented by that horizontal arm, that we're all brothers and sisters, no matter what our level of self-awareness or what our physical structure might look like. And the intersection point between the two, between the vertical and the horizontal, for me, represents the mission self. What I volunteered to do when I decided to incarnate, the task I set myself. So for me, that's what the cross of crucifixion represents. And when I look at the cross of resurrection, I'm looking at 2 kinds of images that appear in the gospel accounts. Because those who encounter the risen Christ have got a problem. Something is very, very different about him, but it's the same Jesus. So they're trying to impress upon people who haven't had these encounters that they really had an encounter with the risen Christ. And so the gospel writers employ 2 different kinds of images, what are sometimes called by Bible scholars the before-after images and the below-above images. So the before-after images, they say, well, it really was he. He ate fish with us. He showed us his hands and his feet. It really was the same Jesus that we hung out with for 3 years beforehand. So they're called the before-after images they employ. But then there are the below-above images. So for instance, they didn't recognize him at first. Mary of Magdala thought he was the gardener. The 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus had a long conversation with him on the road, and they still didn't recognize him until it came to the breaking of bread, the shifting of dimensions. At the same time, he's able to walk through walls. He's really an indication of what quantum tunneling looks like. So the below above are showing us he's radically transformed. So it's the same Jesus, but he's radically transformed. So I would call that the cross of resurrection. And we have to engage with that in order to find this extraordinary mystery, to find it meaningful. for ourselves. So just a few concluding remarks then as a result of these things. Recently, we finished a great retreat. It was about, I think about 35, 36 of us together, at Bishop's Ranch. And for our last Mass, at the very, very end of it, there was this beautiful chant. Anaka sang it for us. I can't remember the name of it right now, but there was this beautiful mystical chant at the very end of Mass. And my comment at the end of it was to say that, okay, I'm sure that at the Last Supper, Jesus and the disciples and his mother and all of the women who were present at the Last Supper, they probably ended the Seder meal with some really beautiful, mystical Jewish music. But then what happened? Then there was Gethsemane and there was Golgotha. And so in some senses, it starts off on a high, the Passover, and it ends on a high, resurrection, but in between, it's as low could go. And so we hear, for instance, that at the moment that Jesus died, that the veil of the temple in Jerusalem was rent in two. Now, this reminds me of what we call in my language, ÓLaoire, a thin place, a place where the veil between the mystical and the mundane is diaphanous, or between the secular and the sacred. It's split and you can see through the veil. So in some senses, that's exactly what this mystery entails. It means the ability to locate these thin places. And they're not just physical, geographical locations. They can be times of the year, like the Easter season or Christmas season or whatever, times when the veil is thin. In my tradition, we call that, for instance, Samhain and Bealtaine at the beginning of summer and the beginning of winter, when the veils are so thin that extra-dimensional entities are flowing through from one side to the other. And when I look at this extraordinary week in the life of Jesus, it feels to me that it's a kind of a week-long fractal of a 3-year career. Now, a fractal is simply a pattern that recurs at an infinite number of scales. So this, for me, is a week-long fractal of a 3-year career. And the 3-year career, in some senses, was a fractal of his entire lifetime, which in turn was a fractal of the human condition since the arrival of Homo Sapiens. So we got patterns within patterns within patterns. And Jesus, for me, then represents the prototype of how to harvest every part of this for spiritual evolution. Because I do not believe for a moment that it was Jesus' death per se, that was most important, but his entire life commitment to his mission. I've said to you many times that I believe that if Jesus had lived to be an old man in his 80s and that he held his grandchildren on his knees, he would have been no less effective, because it was his commitment to harvesting every situation and every relationship in his life for spirituality. For me, this was a man who never forgot who God is, who never forgot who himself is, who never forgot who his neighbor is, and who never forgot what his mission is. And the most important thing in some senses, I believe that Jesus was part of a team, as we all are. We're like concentric waves rippling out from a divine diamond dropped into the lake of life. And so the initial, wave was maybe Jesus, his mother Mary, Mary Magdalene, John the Beloved. And then the next kind of wave would have been the 12 disciples. And then outside of that, maybe the 72 other disciples. And then outside of that, the Jesus movement. And then in our times, little communities like our own, trying to awaken to our purpose in life. And both triumph and tragedy bring out the best and the worst in us. We've certainly seen that during the pandemic. Great tragedies and great triumphs bring out the best and the worst in us. People show their true colors in triumphs and in tragedies. And so in this Easter story, we have the true colors of the priests, the high priests. We see the colors of Pilate and Herod and the mob and the soldiers and the 12 and Judas. At the same time, we see the evidence of people like Veronica and his mother Mary and Magdalene and John the Beloved. So sandwiched between Passover and resurrection are the garden and the cross, not just for Jesus, but for every single one of us. So I asked myself then finally, what really defined Jesus? Was it the crucifixion or was it the resurrection? And I asked myself, which defines our community, our companions on the journey? You know, are we a community focused on crucifixion or a community focused on resurrection? And then finally, every single one of us can ask the same question. Which defines you? The crucifixion or the resurrection? Namaste, my brothers and sisters.